Chapter 27. Challenges for Incumbent Automakers. In 1927, Ford's franchised auto dealers booked 400,000 customer reservations for the 1928 Ford Model A, within weeks of launch, totaling $360 million of pre-production purchase intent or $4.9 billion in 2018 dollars. In 2016, Tesla via the internet and its own stores booked 400,000 customer reservations for the 2018 Tesla Model 3, within weeks of launch, at an assumptive average selling price of $42,000, totaling $16.8 billion of pre-production purchase intent. In 1927, the U.S. population size was 119 million and in 2018, 327.2 million. Adjusted for population size, one could say the Ford event had a significance closer to $13.47 billion in 2018 dollars, close enough to $16.8 billion to render a possible match. Challenges for incumbent automakers 90 or so years later, as the world turns. In 2021, the following standard industry modeling assumptions may still appear to apply. Although, as we are here to discover, taken as a whole, this compelling 5-point introspective is fatally flawed on account of externalities. 1. That it will be possible to segregate an OEM's aspirational corporate autonomous fleet, commanding Uber-like $2.20 per mile fares, from the dealership sales and leasing model for manually operated vehicles sold to consumers, leaving the OEM and its dealership service partners no more disrupted than it currently is when selling vehicles to Uber drivers. Just much better off once the corporate autonomous fleet is able to displace Uber drivers and bank the savings on their labor as corporate profits. 2. That while prospectively autonomous EV fleet vehicles are being offered to individual customers by insurgent upstarts, principally Tesla, these upstarts are capped by capital intensity of expansion to a negligible and temporary circa 1 to 2% share of the auto market, and can thus be safely ignored as an anomaly, until traditional industry is ready to swamp them with production volumes of an equivalent product, and close them out on price with economies of scale. 3. That consumers faced with the option of ride-sharing are on trend to abandon individual car ownership anyway, in favor of fractional leasing on demand. In other words, ride-sharing, and such trends can be accelerated by an OEM with the advent of vehicle autonomy, given the availability of high margins with scope to moderate or accelerate this trend at will. From there to wild innovations of subscription-based transport and reimagining the interior of a vehicle as an interactive shopping mall, a traveling holographic conference suite, an IMAX entertainment dome and a mobile pod hotel for each auto brand's loyal, fully disenfranchised and captive, consumer audience. 4. That despite any nuance of product and price intentionally deployed by an OEM to defend its core internal combustion business from self-cannibalization, the ratio of EV sales experienced by an OEM measures the market niche willing to pay a climate change anxiety premium in terms of cost and convenience, and the vast majority of vehicle sales, namely of internal combustion vehicles, is a poll of real-world customer preference. Therefore, except for regulators imposing anti-commercial demands to move entrenched auto industry competition in lockstep, with consumers getting whatever car they are allowed to choose at whatever price it costs, inclusive of the regulatory burden paid in cash or taxes of retooling auto OEMs, industry-wide, and in any event the traditional auto industry essentially supplies all the cars, and that is that. 5. That auto industry regulations are the driver of automotive technology change, and regulations are negotiated between governments, labor unions and auto industry representatives, centered on determining the regulatory cost burden consumers and taxpayers, the only party not represented at the table, can be expected to absorb and over what timescale, carefully weighing in the balance the political ramifications of both cost and delay, and with no harm done to auto industry economics or GDP as a basis for taxation as the bottom line. Thus, with the advent of full autonomy, given the above set of industry assumptions, consumer choice for 98% of the auto market at first glance may appear to look like this. A. Pay the OEM's in-house autonomous ride-hailing service, or its ride-sharing, hailing and billing middle-layer partner, like Uber or Lyft, something in the order of $2.20 per mile for the convenience of transportation on demand, and for the avoidance of all responsibilities for owning or leasing a car. Or B. Pay 45 cents per mile for owning a new Toyota Camry, or 61 cents per mile for owning a recent model year used BMW 328i, each over 5 years and 75,000 miles, according to Edmunds' true cost of ownership estimates. Note that the average of 45 cents and 61 cents total cost per mile above comes to 53 cents, close to the IRS 54 cents U.S. fleet average figure. Hence it must be tempting for auto industry executives and for retained experts and analysts in their orbit to conclude that there is a viable path to offer the consumer the choice of a $2.20 per mile autonomous corporate ride-sharing service, alongside 54-cent per mile traditional vehicle ownership, simultaneously and in parallel, and this is the reality applicable to a choiceless 98% of the auto market. Thus the 2% can be ignored as an anomaly. Except the above modeling assumptions are fundamentally flawed under the real-world conditions of a broken monopoly, that customers and investors can escape. This internal logic of the 20th century automotive industry ignores the fact that by far the lowest societal cost option, for customer and taxpayer alike, is to casually observe this legacy industry expire at the conclusion of competitiveness of the internal combustion technology it was built upon, without anyone besides its shareholders feeling the cost of write-offs and retooling, and only then if they feel it's worth it. There is nothing preventing customers who are in the market for a mid-market to premium new vehicle, simply sitting on aging vehicles, hailing rides or leasing vehicles they know they can offload to an OEM at the expiry of a lease, without concern for residual values, while waiting in a reservation line to be supplied with a full autonomy prepped electric vehicle to own, supplied from outside the traditional auto industry. Thus evading any necessity to pay a regulatory premium on cars produced by OEMs to assist this industry to retool, and forming a groundswell of millions of objectors to bailing out this industry, again, via the tax code. Without a radical shift of C-suite and boardroom mindset from a presumption of consumer entrapment without leverage, to the existential necessity to compete to deliver customer value, this balance of 2% at the time of writing, that is compound doubling annually like rice grains on a chessboard, is the needle to the giant bubble that is the 98% of the auto industry. Update 2021. To its credit for what it is worth, VW has publicly acknowledged that it is facing a crisis of change management, in the face of fierce competition from industry-leading competitor, Tesla. Incidentally, should Tesla wish to buy a problem, it could afford to purchase VW outright many times over, as could Tesla's CEO Elon Musk, personally. The reason Tesla has not simply purchased VW to immediately multiply its access to general assembly capacity many-fold, speaks to the ultimate economic bottom line. When the ultimate goal of every automaker is to produce a fleet of autonomous electric vehicles, it is cheaper, more profitable and less dreadful in terms of a management headache, and likely quicker to scale without mishap, for Tesla to build design-for-purpose VW-like production capacity from the ground up, than to navigate VW's liabilities, be they contractual, cultural or financial, or to resolve the incompatibilities of its internal combustion-centric production systems. Author's note. To cut a long story short, the ability to supply a driver with every car, the Tesla Autonomy Suite, is significantly more valuable than the ability to build a car, especially in head-to-head competition with Tesla, and so Tesla will in due course, very predictably be able to demand any corporate behavior from VW and similar, in trade for its very survival, with no necessity to take on the role of managing the business. Back to the long version. Regarding production staff, there is nothing that VW owns and Tesla needs, that Tesla is obliged to purchase the VW business to obtain. VW doesn't own its production staff. If Tesla needs any particular subset of VW's staff, it is simply for Tesla to post employment opportunities on competitive terms, with better job security and prospects for advancement. This is easy for Tesla to offer, impossible for a job applicant who is a current employee of VW to doubt, and impossible for VW management to counter affordably or with any credibility. Furthermore, stripping VW of employees with both relevant skills and a can-do attitude towards building the future of transportation, without need or obligation to hire the remainder, adds training costs and further misaligns workplace culture at VW. The same applies to legacy OEMs across the board. An innovator's dilemma par excellence. By far the greatest challenge from an internal combustion OEM's perspective, is that there is a sharp penalty and prospect for presenting the consumer with a choice between a standard depreciating vehicle, and an autonomous vehicle capable of paying its own way as a robotaxi. This penalty manifests itself in terms of self-cannibalizing its traditional sales model and immediately stripping out market residual values from its legacy lease fleet inventory, a liability that leaseholders retain the right to offload to the OEM upon the expiry of a lease. For the OEM, the sale of a small percentage of robotaxis relative to the scale of its legacy fleet, thus impacted, is compounded by the prospect of giving away the lion's share of robotaxi profits per vehicle to the customer that it desperately requires to defray the same lease fleet losses. Given the market availability of a robotaxi for a customer to buy, no level of price discounting of legacy vehicles, new or used, short of offering the customer a free chauffeur as an employee, has any fair market value to the customer, to compare with the value of owning a robotaxi for profit. As a mode of transport, the comparative fair market value of a manually operated internal combustion vehicle, be it new, or a 3 or 5-year-old car at the end of its lease, is $0. In the presence of sufficient autonomous vehicles, if a vehicle can't be sold to recoup its build cost and can't be retrofitted economically with full autonomy, its value is just recycling materials to make autonomous vehicles from, unless some value can be derived from manual ride sharing. This observation is strongly predictive of global fleet replacement, long prior to ordinary estimates of the economic service life of an internal combustion vehicle. In the presence of a market choice to replace an aging vehicle with something fundamentally better in economic terms, than simply the next iteration of the same technology, simply the newer model of the same car. Hence replacement rates of the existing global road fleet, whether or not the legacy fleet is pushed to manual ride sharing to accelerate its calendar life depreciation, the length of its calendar life can be expected to shorten by many years from historical norms. Instead of the prior paradigm of economic service life, marked by the intersection of reducing desirability due to corrosion and wear, intersecting the curve of escalating maintenance costs, the end of the economic life of the legacy fleet will be marked by brute availability of autonomous vehicles. This will come as fast as they can be produced on grounds of profitability to displace the need to move a manually operated internal combustion vehicle on grounds of cost. Likely between 10 and 15 years sooner than historical 20-year fleet replacement rates from the advent of driverless full autonomy. Whereas scrap value will predictably and rapidly intersect the declining value of newer and newer legacy vehicles, culminating in scrap value at the factory gate, on account of rising demand for materials to make robotaxis. Additionally, stripping out the residual market value of second-hand vehicles, strips out the rationale to treat a new vehicle as valid collateral for vehicle lending, market-wide. Thus exposing existing borrowers to negative equity loans, lenders to under-collateralized credit defaults, and stalling the sale of new vehicles. Hence, with the advent of vehicle autonomy on the immediate horizon, the notion of a global vehicle fleet transitioning to electric full autonomy, taking 20 or 30 years to a state of partial transition, at the leisure of the incumbent auto industry, should be considered a fundamental error of economic modeling and management forecasting. Failure of auto industry management to revise such forecasts radically, at least internally, will all but certainly close out any available avenue for business continuity much beyond 2025. Author's note: certainly envisioning such an avenue is beyond the current skill of this author. If that were not enough, an OEM offering the customer the choice of an, even more profitable, autonomous EV robotaxi, runs the risk of contributing to distracting millions of consumers from purchasing a car with an engine, autonomous or not, thus leaving engine manufacturing capacity stranded, costing overheads and shedding asset value, while the OEM lacks the requisite battery manufacturing capacity to supply waiting demand. In contrast, the autonomous EV specialist, with a fleet prepped for full autonomy or already operating as a robotaxi fleet, faces no such conundrum, no such innovator's dilemma, precisely because it doesn't have any significant non-autonomous lease fleet liabilities to defray, nor any engine manufacturing capacity to strand, in the event of hundreds of thousands if not millions of customers opting to wait in line for manufacturing capacity, it does not yet have. On the contrary, evidence of vast deposited customer purchasing intent isn't as good as it ever gets market signal to management and external investors, in a company such as Tesla and its supply chain, to accelerate investment in building the requisite manufacturing capacity, to monetize self-evident opportunity. In general, Even in the unlikely event that the technology of full vehicle autonomy can be developed by an OEM independently of Tesla or procured on reasonable terms from a third party, within a relevant window of opportunity, the obvious challenges for such an OEM to bring full autonomy to internal combustion are as follows. Fuel cost, maintenance frequency, limited drivetrain lifespan, safe automation of fueling infrastructure, emissions, and the inevitability of legal challenges to any attempt to disenfranchise automotive dealerships. Additional challenges include the inevitable refusal of dealerships to permit over-the-air network maintenance status monitoring, always-on fleet monitoring and vehicle systems updates, comprehensive wireless internet access to vehicles by an OEM, that stands to infringe upon the dealer-customer relationship, to which dealers that invested in building and maintaining a customer base for 20th-century automotive brands have a legally defensible prior claim. All of this and more conspires against the case for external private investment in OEM developments of autonomous internal combustion vehicles, and more generally in OEMs that are heavily exposed to navigating significant issues with internal change management, prior to achieving the ability to launch an autonomous EV fleet, let alone at scale. Managing any of these challenges is a defensive play. None of it adds any customer or shareholder value in advance of emerging with historical market dominance restored. If independent private equity is looking for exposure to autonomous EV adoption, it will naturally look first to autonomous EV specialists such as Tesla, and has done so, and to vendors like LG Chem and Nvidia, positioned to supply a basket of OEMs in dire need of battery and vehicle autonomy technology, on account of competition from Tesla and others, particularly from China. Not to invest in an OEM whose quarterly metrics are principally composed of traditional revenue streams that are almost entirely harmed by electric vehicles, and whose books are laden with incipient liabilities as a result. Similar considerations apply to vehicle customers faced with the market choice of simply investing in, or reserving, a prospectively autonomous EV over the internet, from Tesla or similar if any, as opposed to buying a prospectively autonomous internal combustion vehicle from a dealership, but also a prospectively autonomous EV from any internal combustion OEM brand, that is forced to grapple internally with the aforementioned challenges, as the primary focus of its business. Indeed, overexposure to internal combustion marks the vendor as a non-specialist and a potential risk prospect, with regards to ongoing ability to honor a warranty, despite the opposing perception from within the auto industry on account of presumptively unassailable scale, albeit in a previous technology. The competitive landscape in the presence of full autonomy. With every 1,000 paid autonomous electric vehicle miles per vehicle averaged across 1 million robotaxi fleet, the delta of 12 cents and 54 cents per mile exposes nominally $420 million of incremental gross profitability, on account of total operating cost savings, to sink into incremental autonomous EV production capacity, in other words roughly every week per million vehicles in ride-hailing operation. This is just the profit delta, not the total profitability, even in the face of direct competition from autonomous internal combustion at any scale. Thus, upon the advent of autonomous EV robotaxi fleet earnings, there is no financial constraint in prospect to build out autonomous EV capacity against internal combustion competition, autonomous or not, just as fast as new manufacturing capacity can physically be built and ramped up. Then there is the matter of stranding non-autonomous fleet assets. While the prospect of getting stuck with a vehicle with de minimis trade-in value and steep negative equity on a vehicle loan is a real nuisance, it is true to say that many Cubans have turned making do with the car you have into an art form. Not to make too light of it, but the same thing happening to you when you own €154.1 billion or $176 billion of cars and trucks while your company is only worth $55.59 billion, market cap at the time of writing, in this example Daimler, partly based on owning a giant lease fleet of cars and trucks. This is an unmitigated disaster that can't be helped. Using Tesla's even more cautious figures than those documented here, in rapid due course, the customer can expect a market choice between buying a Toyota Camry that will cost them, per Edmunds, $34,053 over 5 years or a Tesla Model 3 that will earn them, net of a presumptive 30% Tesla network ride-hailing and billing fee, $105,000 over 5 years, at their option, if fares per mile are only $1 and not the current average market value of $2.20. The difference between these options includes saving the aforementioned $34,053, for a total difference of $139,053, assuming the other alternative under consideration on a budget for a Model 3, was the $26,719 Toyota Camry. Most likely it wasn't. This is not a comparison shopping exercise that clever brand advertising and editorials from sympathetic journalists can be expected to overcome, or conceal, for the benefit of Toyota. Given that market value of ride-sharing fares is on the order of $2.20 per mile, Uber, Lyft, not $1. There is another greater than $1 per fare-paying mile, to match current market rates before accounting for any likely market premium for privacy, safety or novelty of hailing a Tesla autonomous EV. Realistic duty ratio is also higher than 50% in dedicated robotaxi use. Hence, Tesla's example readily allows for a typical 15,000-mile annual consumption of private owner use, for commuting and leisure, to be allocated to empty miles without impacting the customers, or Tesla's earnings relative to Tesla's figures. Calculating for the vehicle to seek 45,000 miles of $1 fares from a remaining budget of 75,000 miles per year, after deducting 15,000 of essentially free motoring for the owner's private use, simply alters the duty ratio assumption from 50% to a more realistic 60% while committed to the fleet. It is a trivial matter to route fares in a city to the nearest next ride, optimized fleet-wide for minimal empty miles between fares and attending a charging station periodically. Importantly for the hard economics of competition between internal combustion and electric vehicles in an autonomous context, once again, Tesla's $1 per mile fare example is based on allowing for a 50-50 ratio of fare and non-fare miles. Therefore, the average of Tesla's robotaxi pricing model for the average lifetime mile of the vehicle is 50 cents per mile, not $1. 50 cents is 4 cents lower than the 54 cents cost basis of moving a U.S. fleet average internal combustion vehicle, at U.S. gasoline prices, and the fleet average U.S. vehicle does not have the cost of an autonomy suite accounted for in the price. Naturally, any territory that insists on levying an 80% fuel tax or similar on gasoline, that stands to increase internal combustion running costs still further above this 54 cents figure, would just throw the competitive economics of autonomous internal combustion versus electrification to the wolves. Any window of opportunity to regain a market advantage on account of legacy OEM scale, opens at the advent of full autonomy coming into the possession of an auto OEM on reasonable terms, and closes on approach to market maturity, with market prices of autonomous ride-sharing mileage converging on the cost per mile of operating an internal combustion vehicle. The race against time between the window of opportunity opening and closing is to defray outgoing business model liabilities and to replicate manufacturing scale in autonomous electric vehicles, adequate to replace internal combustion manufacturing capacity. This is required in order to survive head-to-head competition with 21st-century autonomous EV specialists for the long haul, and so to halt continual, rapid and incontestable loss of market share to extinction. Author's note: shocking, right? Memo to Tony Seba, Stanford, Edu. There would appear to be a Mariana Trench-sized fault in modeling assumptions that give rise to forecasting a long-term trending loss of customer interest in individual car ownership with the advent of ride-sharing, once converged with full autonomy. With broad market realization that individual car ownership means $50,000 to $100,000 of profits, instead of $30,000 to $50,000 of losses over 5 years, trending loss of interest in individual vehicle ownership will therefore most assuredly inflect. Missing this key inflection point is a classic failure of self-referential analysis. See chapter, of Optimism and Pessimism. This is already officially announced by Tesla, and there is only so long that the media can keep public awareness at bay. The interest in corporate fleet ownership is not market-driven, it's an industry in panic with no alternatives, hoping against reason that it is somehow still in control of an auto market it used to monopolize, and monopolizes no more. Regards existing OEM investors. As for existing external investors, investors in 100-year-old businesses, traditionally expect to be paid regular dividends, not to be asked to fund their investees' urgent cash requirements on a scale approaching or exceeding their market cap, proportionately, the whole value of their shareholding. Especially not to fund the retirement of an automotive company's automotive assets that have generated all of the company's historic earnings, and thus stand as the basis of any market cap above zero. In addition to the cost of retiring legacy fleet liabilities, including lease fleets and engine production lines, It should also be taken as read that launching an OEM-branded autonomous fleet against individual private owners, likely injuring them financially by stranding them with vehicles they will struggle to resell, while hoarding the opportunity to earn corporate robotaxi revenues priced to displace a brand's owner drivers, driving for Uber and Lyft, is a formula for a brand relationship disaster, the likes of which has never before been witnessed. To the extent an OEM holds brand equity out as a line item of value, this line item will not survive. Nevertheless, the question remains, could the timely arrival of auto OEM access to full autonomy, on reasonable terms, for immediate deployment in new internal combustion vehicles available by the millions from existing production lines, save an OEM? Despite all of these hurdles, there is logically a fractional chance for 20th century automakers to launch in-house fleets, or ride-sharing affiliate, rental firm or dealership-owned fleets, at sufficient scale and in sufficient time, and so to sell generic autonomous internal combustion mileage in sufficient amounts to bootstrap a technology transition. We will look at that next.